The river was merciless, its raging water swallowing everything in its path. Trapped, exhausted, and fighting for his life, a lone gray wolf had no escape. The current dragged him under, stealing his breath, his strength, his hope. He had fought for hours, but the river was stronger. And just when all seemed lost, when the cold, black water threatened to claim him forever, something happened. Someone came. But who would risk their life for a wild animal? And what happened after was truly unbelievable. Stay with us to witness a story of survival, fate, and an unbreakable bond that defied all odds. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more incredible stories like this one. Asterisk. Chapter 1. The River's Fury. The storm had been relentless. For hours, heavy rain had poured from the sky, drenching the vast wilderness. Rivers that were once peaceful turned into violent torrents, swallowing the land and anything unfortunate enough to be caught in their path. And right now, trapped in the chaos of the floodwaters, a lone gray wolf was fighting for his life. The current was ruthless, dragging him downstream like a lifeless branch. He kicked his powerful legs, but the water was stronger. His claws tore at nothing but empty air as the river twisted and churned around him. He had made a mistake. The moment the ground beneath him had collapsed, he knew. He had been trying to cross near the riverbank, but the earth was too soft, too soaked from the storm. One step, and it was gone. Now, there was no escape. He thrashed against the current, his muscles burning. His head broke the surface for a brief second, just enough to gulp a desperate breath before the water pulled him under again. He was drowning. A log rushed past him, slamming against his ribs. Pain shot through his body, but he had no time to react. More debris surrounded him. Branches, pieces of trees ripped from the ground. One jagged branch caught his hind leg, twisting his body sharply before the current freed him again. His lungs screamed for air. His vision blurred. He was losing. A rush of fear unlike anything he had ever known surged through him. He had been a lone wolf for years, relying on nothing but his instincts. But instincts meant nothing here. The river didn't care. And then, a voice. A sound that didn't belong to the storm, or the wind, or the crashing debris. A human voice. Through the haze of exhaustion and water-filled ears, he heard it, loud, urgent, cutting through the storm like a beacon. He barely had the strength to turn his head, but in the blur of rain and darkness, he saw it. A figure. On the riverbank. A man. His silhouette was barely visible through the downpour, but the wolf could see his movements. The man wasn't running away. He wasn't just watching. He was coming. The wolf's vision swam as the current pulled him under again. His limbs were heavy, numb from the cold. His chest burned as water forced its way into his lungs. His body told him to stop fighting. But that voice, the one that had cut through the storm, it was still there, closer, and then impact. Something strong wrapped around him, a force that didn't belong to the river, something pulling him, lifting him, breaking through the surface of the water. The wolf barely had time to register what was happening before a new rush of air filled his lungs. He coughed, choking on both water and shock. And then, warmth, solid ground beneath him. The feeling of hands gripping him, pulling him out of the river's deadly grasp. The wolf collapsed onto the mud, his body too weak to move. He barely managed to lift his head, and when he did, he found himself staring into the eyes of the one who had saved him. A man, soaked, panting, shaking from the cold. And yet, his expression wasn't fear, it wasn't anger, it was something else, something the wolf had never seen in human eyes before. The wolf lay motionless in the mud, his body too weak to do anything but breathe. Each inhale was a sharp, painful effort, as if his ribs had been crushed under the weight of the river's fury. Water dripped from his thick gray fur, pooling beneath him. His limbs trembled violently, half from exhaustion, half from the bone-chilling cold that still clung to him. But he was alive, and so was the man beside him. The human knelt just a few feet away, soaked to the bone, his chest rising and falling in heavy gasps. His wet clothes clung to his frame, his hands gripping the earth as if steadying himself. For a long moment, neither moved. The only sound was the relentless pounding of the rain and the distant roar of the river that had nearly claimed them both. The wolf's golden eyes flickered toward the man. Why? Why had he jumped in? Humans and wolves weren't allies. They were enemies, competitors in the wild, fighting for the same scarce resources. The wolf had spent his life avoiding them, knowing that their world was one of guns and steel traps, not compassion. And yet, this one had saved him. The man exhaled sharply and wiped the rain from his face before turning his gaze toward the wolf. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but there was no hostility in them, no fear. Carefully, the man reached for his pack, unbuckling a strap with stiff, frozen fingers. The wolf's muscles tensed instinctively, though he was in no condition to fight. His ears flicked back, watching as the man pulled out something, a thick, dry blanket. The human hesitated, then with slow movements, draped the fabric over the wolf's soaked body. The wolf flinched. The touch was foreign, strange, but the warmth was immediate. His body, still trembling, welcomed it. The man sat back on his heels, watching. He didn't move closer, didn't try to touch him again. He was giving the wolf space, time. The rain continued to fall in heavy sheets, the wind howling through the trees. The river, still swollen with the storm's fury, raged just a few feet away. Another wrong step, another moment too late, and the wolf wouldn't be breathing right now. The man knew that, too. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the human stood. He winced slightly, pressing a hand to his ribs as he took a shaky step back. His clothes were soaked, his body likely just as cold and battered as the wolf's. But instead of leaving, he did something unexpected. He turned toward the trees and whistled, a low, sharp sound cutting through the rain. The wolf's ears perked slightly, his instincts still sluggish, but alert enough to register the action. Footsteps. Then, a horse. Through the mist and rain, a dark silhouette emerged. A sturdy, muscular horse, its coat slick with water, stepped forward from the tree line. It moved toward the man without hesitation, as if answering a familiar call. The human patted the horse's side before turning back to the wolf, and then he did something even stranger. He crouched down, and in a voice just loud enough to be heard over the storm, spoke. "Let's go." The wolf's ears flicked forward. Go. A surge of instinct told him to resist. He was wild. He didn't follow humans. He didn't belong anywhere near them. But his body told a different story. He was weak, too weak to walk, too weak to run. And the man knew it. With slow, deliberate movements, the human stepped forward. Not with force, not with demand, just an offering, a choice. The wolf growled softly, a feeble warning, but there was no strength behind it. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for the blanket wrapped around the wolf, securing it with careful hands. Then, in a single, fluid motion, he lifted the wolf into his arms. The wolf didn't have the energy to fight. The world spun slightly as the man carried him toward the horse. His breath was steady despite the effort, his arms firm but not rough. And then, before the wolf could even process what was happening, he was settled onto the horse's back, wrapped in warmth, safe. The man climbed up beside him, securing him in place before nudging the horse forward. The storm raged on, but the wolf barely noticed anymore. His body, despite everything, had surrendered to exhaustion. As the horse carried them away from the river, the wolf's heavy eyelids fluttered shut. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, he let go. He slept. The wolf stirred before his eyes even opened. A deep, aching pain ran through his body, a dull reminder of his fight against the river. His limbs felt heavy, as if they no longer belonged to him. The warmth surrounding him was unfamiliar, different from the cold, harsh reality he had known for so long. Then the scent hit him. Wood, smoke, and something even stranger. Human. His golden eyes snapped open. The world around him was dimly lit, the soft glow of firelight flickering across wooden walls. A cabin. Panic surged through his veins. Instinct screamed at him to move, to run, but his body didn't obey. his muscles tensed, his ears flattening as he tried to push himself up. The movement was weak, clumsy. A sharp pain flared in his ribs, forcing a strangled whimper from his throat. From across the room, something shifted. The wolf's ears twitched toward the sound, his breath shallow. His vision, still unfocused, caught the silhouette of a man. The same man, the one who had pulled him from the river. He was sitting near the fire, his back partially turned, a cloth in his hands. He had removed his soaked coat, revealing a simple, long-sleeved shirt that clung to his frame, still damp from the storm. His dark hair was tousled, shadows playing across his face. He hadn't noticed the wolf was awake. Good. The wolf's pulse pounded in his ears. His legs trembled as he forced himself upright. He didn't know where he was, but he knew one thing. He had to leave. His body protested every movement, but he pushed through. With a slow, careful step, he inched toward the door. Then, "I wouldn't do that." The voice was calm, not threatening, but firm. The wolf froze. His eyes darted toward the man who had finally turned his gaze toward him. "I figured you'd wake up soon," the human said, his tone unreadable. "Wasn't sure if you'd try to rip my throat out or run first." The wolf growled weakly, his body lowering slightly in warning. The man didn't move. He simply tossed the cloth he had been holding onto the small wooden table beside him. "You can try," he said, his voice even, "but I don't think you have the strength for it." The wolf hated that he was right. His legs wobbled beneath him. He was too weak to fight, too exhausted to escape, trapped. The man leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp, but not unkind. "You were half dead when I found you," he continued. "Didn't think you'd make it through the night." The wolf's ears twitched. "You should rest." The man gestured toward a thick blanket near the fire. "The storm's still going. You're not going anywhere until it clears." The wolf bared his teeth slightly. He didn't trust this human, couldn't, but his body craved the warmth, the safety. Conflicted, he took a step backward, his head lowering defensively. The man exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Suit yourself," he muttered. He stood, moving toward the fire, and grabbed a steaming cup from the mantel. The scent of something rich, earthy, filled the air. Then something slid across the floor. The wolf's eyes snapped toward it. A plate. Meat. Fresh. The hunger hit him all at once. A deep, twisting pain in his stomach that clawed at him mercilessly. When had he last eaten? Before the river? Before the storm? He couldn't remember. But still, he hesitated. The man sat back down, not looking at him anymore. He took a slow sip from his cup. "Eat or don't," he said simply. "But you're not leaving yet." The wolf's breath came fast and shallow. This wasn't right. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be trusting. And yet, his legs gave out beneath him. The exhaustion won. The last thing he saw before his vision blurred again was the flickering light of the fire, and the untouched food just within reach. The fire crackled softly in the dimly lit cabin, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. The scent of burning wood mixed with the rich aroma of the untouched meat lying near the wolf's weakened body. His golden eyes flickered open, hazy with exhaustion, his limbs heavy and stiff. Hunger gnawed at him, sharp and insistent. His body craved nourishment, but his instincts screamed at him to resist. He was still in the presence of a human, an unpredictable creature, one whose intentions remained unclear. The man sat across the room, unmoving, watching. He had made no attempt to approach, no sign of aggression. He simply waited, his dark eyes studying the wolf with quiet patience. The tension in the air was thick. The wolf's gaze flickered toward the meat once more. His stomach twisted, his body betraying him. He needed to eat. Cautiously, he shifted his weight, his muscles aching with every movement. His ears remained perked, listening for the slightest shift in the man's posture. The human didn't move. Slowly, hesitantly, the wolf stretched his neck forward. His nose twitched as he sniffed the food, testing it for anything unnatural. It smelled fresh, clean. Still, he hesitated. The man exhaled softly, taking another sip from his cup. "It's just food," he muttered. "Not a trap." The wolf tensed at the sound of his voice but didn't retreat. He could hear the steady rhythm of the man's heartbeat, calm and unthreatening. Minutes passed in silence before the wolf finally gave in. With a last wary glance at the human, he lowered his head and took the first bite. The taste of raw meat flooded his senses, and the moment it touched his tongue, his body reacted on pure instinct. He tore into the meal with urgency, swallowing greedily despite his lingering exhaustion. The warmth of the food spread through him, momentarily silencing the hunger that had haunted him for days. The man said nothing. When the wolf finally lifted his head, licking the last remnants of blood from his snout, he expected a reaction, some sign of satisfaction from the human. But there was nothing, just quiet observation. The wolf licked his lips, muscles still tense. The man leaned forward slightly, placing his empty cup on the wooden table beside him. "Good," he said, more to himself than to the wolf. Then slowly he stood. The wolf's body stiffened immediately, his ears flattening against his skull. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to be ready, to attack, to run. But the man didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even reach toward the wolf. Instead, he walked to the door. The wolf watched, every muscle coiled like a spring. The man unlatched the wooden door and pushed it open. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and the fading storm. The snow had finally stopped falling, leaving a thick, white blanket covering the ground outside. The forest stood still, silent except for the distant rush of the river. The human stepped aside. The wolf's breath hitched. Freedom. The open door was an invitation, one the wolf hadn't expected. He flicked his ears, searching for deception, but the man didn't move to stop him. The wolf's legs trembled as he pushed himself up, his body protesting. He was weak, but he could still run. And yet, he didn't. He stood there, staring at the open door, his heart pounding against his ribs. Why? Why was the man letting him go? For the first time in his life, the wolf was presented with a choice. Instinct told him to leave, but something deeper, something unfamiliar, whispered another possibility. What if he stayed? The open door stood before him, an invitation to freedom. The wolf's breath was steady but shallow, his body still weak from exhaustion. The cold air rushed inside, filling the cabin with the crisp scent of wet earth and melting snow. The storm had passed. The world outside was silent, waiting. The human didn't move. He simply stood by the door, his expression unreadable, as if he had already accepted whatever choice the wolf would make. The wolf took a cautious step forward, his paws pressing against the wooden floor. His muscles ached, his ribs still sore from the violent struggle in the river. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave, to return to the wild, to the world he had always known. But something held him back. For the first time in his life, he hesitated. He could run. No one would stop him. No trap, no force, no chain bound him here. And yet, he did not bolt. Why? The human exhaled softly, shifting slightly but making no attempt to force him in either direction. The wolf flicked his ears, his golden eyes darting from the open door to the man's calm stance. This was not how humans behaved. They controlled, they captured, they killed. But this one had pulled him from death's grasp, had given him warmth, food, shelter, had let him rest. And now he was giving him a choice. The wolf took another step, closer to the threshold. The wind nipped at his fur, ruffling the damp strands along his back. The forest beyond the door stretched into endless white, the trees heavy with fresh snow. His world was out there. But something was missing. A deep, primal instinct burned in his chest. The wild had never been kind to him. He had lived alone, fought alone, survived alone. No pack, no den. Nothing but the constant battle to stay alive. He had spent so long fighting, and for the first time in his life, he had been shown something different. He glanced back at the human. The man still hadn't spoken. His dark eyes were steady, patient. He wasn't waiting for the wolf to obey. He wasn't demanding loyalty or submission. He was simply offering something the wolf had never known before, a place to stay. The wolf's heart pounded. He was still weak. He wouldn't last long out there, not yet. He took a step back, away from the door. The man's eyes flickered just for a moment, but he didn't react otherwise. He merely reached for the handle and in a slow, deliberate motion, pulled the door closed. The wolf tensed. The sound of the latch clicking into place sent a strange feeling through him. Not fear, not regret. Finality. His choice had been made. The human nodded slightly, as if he understood. He turned and moved back toward the fire, tossing another log onto the flames. The warmth grew, spreading through the small space. The wolf hesitated, unsure of what came next. The man didn't force an answer. Instead, he simply sat, his back resting against the wall, letting the silence settle between them. A quiet understanding. The wolf exhaled through his nose, his body slowly relaxing. The wild was still in him, always would be. But for now, in this moment, he would rest. The fire crackled, the wind howled outside. And for the first time in his life, the wolf was not alone. The days passed slowly, marked by the rhythmic dance of snowflakes outside the cabin's window. The storm had long since faded, leaving behind a crisp silence that blanketed the wilderness. Inside, the wolf's strength was returning. His ribs no longer ached with each breath. His legs, once weak and trembling, now carried him steadily across the wooden floor. The deep exhaustion that had once clung to him like a shadow had begun to fade, replaced by something unfamiliar, something that felt almost like peace. The man, his rescuer, had not caged him, had not forced him to stay. He had not treated the wolf like a pet, nor had he expected submission. He simply coexisted. The wolf observed him closely. He watched the man tend to his daily tasks, chopping wood, setting traps, boiling water over the fire. There was a quiet steadiness to him, a presence that never wavered, never threatened. And the wolf did not leave. He had every opportunity. The door was never locked. The man often stepped outside, sometimes disappearing into the forest for hours. Yet, each time the wind carried the scent of freedom through the open door, the wolf remained. At first, he told himself it was because he needed more time to recover. But now, as his body grew stronger, that excuse held less weight. One morning, the wolf sat by the window, staring at the endless white. The sun had begun to rise, casting long golden streaks across the snow-covered land. This world had always belonged to him. The wild called to him still, whispering in the wind, reminding him of what he was. And yet, when the man moved across the room, placing a fresh piece of meat near the fire, the wolf's ears flicked toward him. Something shifted in his chest. He was no longer certain which world he belonged to. The next day, the man stood at the door, adjusting his coat. His rifle was slung across his back, and his horse stood waiting just outside, pawing at the snow. "I'll be back before sundown," he said casually, as if speaking to another person instead of a wild animal. "Storm's coming in tomorrow. I need to check the traps." The wolf didn't move from his spot by the fire. The man exhaled, then grabbed the door handle. He hesitated for just a moment before adding, "If you're gone when I get back, I get it." He didn't wait for an answer. He simply stepped out into the cold, pulling the door shut behind him. The wolf's ears twitched. For a long time he didn't move. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet. His paws moved toward the door, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with quiet certainty. The latch was loose. He could nudge it open with his nose if he wanted. He stood there, staring at the door, at the world beyond it. The choice was his. Minutes passed. The fire crackled softly behind him, filling the room with warmth. And finally, he turned away. Not out of fear, not out of weakness, but because for the first time he had chosen to stay. Some bonds are formed not by force, but by choice. This wolf was given a chance at freedom, yet he found something more powerful, a connection that defied instinct. What do you think? Could a wild animal truly choose loyalty over the call of the wild? Let us know in the comments. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who loves incredible stories of survival and trust.